are live. The Lift Big Eat Big show number 14. Today we're talking everything to do with deadlifts. The technical side, the accessories to bring up your deadlift, how to deadlift more weight, deadlift programming, everything to do with deadlifting. Obviously, we have two pretty hectic deadlifters on this podcast. Colm, obviously, 2 times world strongest man competitor. How much have you deadlifted, Colm?
My best is 410 or 900 pounds in competition.
Oh, okay. So a
That's
900
in
pound deadlifter.
strongman rules and then 400 in powerlifting rules.
Damn, okay, that's some serious weight. And then obviously Mona's here as the Olympic weightlifter. How much have you pulled, Mona?
170 kilos, but I'm not sure what that is in pounds. Wait, let me check.
That's like 390-ish. At what
Let's
body
check.
weight? Like 60 kilos?
Yeah,
It's pretty big.
2.2,
That's some serious weight.
374
374.
pounds, yeah.
That's pretty hectic. I've only done 215 kilos at 84. What's that? I'm not sure what that is. But
That is
either way,
473.
473 at 84 kilos. That's okay. That's not too bad. So we've got some deadlifters on here. We're going to go through all of that. As usual, Lift Big Eat Big Underground. If you want to join, we have a private Discord community, all the training programs, including a deadlift specialization that is in that. Also, the Farm Boy Strong program that took one of our members from a 240 kilo deadlift to a 260 kilo deadlift in 8 weeks, which is pretty nuts, and got pretty close to lifting the Dinny Stones as well. I think it was 3 kilos off the Dinny Stone weight. So you can definitely check that out. Farm Boy Strong, that is on the website as well, and Lift Big Eat Big Underground. But we're going to go straight into this. We're going to start on the technical side of pulling big lifts from the floor. Com, what are your go-to, I guess, technical pieces that most people miss when they're looking to maximize the deadlift?
So, with the goal of pulling the most amount of weight as possible, pulling out the tension in the bar and learning to get tight, that's something I see done wrong, honestly, all the time. But to me, that's the first thing you want to try and master. So I first got into the idea of this from Andy Bolton. So the first man to deadlift 1,000 pounds. I've mentioned his book, Deadlift Dynamite, before. I'm a big fan of that. But if you're curious about it, you can just YouTube search like Andy Bolton 1,000 pound deadlift, or honestly any of his deadlifts, and you'll see prior to him pulling, he does this little thing. He calls it the triple pump, but basically he's pulling a little bit of tension out of the bar each time before he actually pulls the bar. I don't necessarily recommend doing it 3 times, but if you can at least master that idea of pulling the tension, it's going to allow you to actually drive your legs directly in the ground with your hips staying relatively in the same position. Whereas most of the time, like you'll see beginners do it all the time, they'll think of it as just lifting the weight off the floor and their hips will shoot up first. There are some other issues it can be, but like 90% of the time with beginners, I see that is if you can really pull that tension out of the bar. In an ideal world, if you get good at it, you should be able to just lift the bar by pulling out the tension. This is with sub-maximal weights. But I remember filming a video for it might have been for this off-season strongman program, where there's a pause deadlift 1 inch off the ground, it's a little drill to teach you how to take that tension out. And ideally, you want to be using your body weight. You're kind of sitting back against the bar, using your body weight to counterbalance it. So it is very different to how, this is for powerlifting or for strongman, obviously very different to how like a clean pull or something like that. But in this context of trying to lift the most weight, that's the first thing I would go to. Being able to do that with a relatively neutral spine, I think is like, if you can do that, all the other stuff is easy after that point. That would be my first go-to.
I want to go down I wouldn't say a controversial route, but more of a debated route within probably the most debated part of the deadlift, and that is the rounded upper back. So a lot of people will talk about, okay, you have to have a neutral spine. If you're having a rounded middle upper back, you're just waiting to injure yourself. What's your take on that, Colm?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've seen it. It's also now in some circles,
the optimal technique,
right? They talk about rounding the lower back as well, and
really?
being okay with it. Yeah, with the idea that You adapt to however you train. So, in theory, if you manage your loads appropriately and keep like progressively loading smallly, a small amount each time, you should be able to do it. But yeah, personally, I just don't think a little bit of upper back rounding or kyphosis, not the end of the world. Even a small amount of lumbar rounding can be, like, everyone is likely rounding to a small extent, but overall, I think aim to keep it as neutral as possible. So to me, even if, let's say we accept that argument that it is totally safe if you're managing your loads correctly to round your lower back, all right, let's say we accept that. To me, it still doesn't really have an advantage. All it's going to do is allow you to pull. Generally, with a rounded back, you can pull really fast off the floor, but then you hit just above the knee and you hit this massive sticking point, and it's really hard to go from a rounded back in that position to suddenly getting it straight. If you start relatively neutral, once you hit that kind of just above the knee or just below the knee position, you can actually use your glutes to drive those hips forward and extend the hip. And like part of the reason of deadlifting, we want to train the glutes, right? So, and especially for strongman, like you want to be good at that extension for partial deadlifts, for loading stones, loading bags, like to help with yoke, with everything. So, yeah, overall, even if it's accepted that it can be safe, I just don't think it's optimal. I think going with a more balanced approach, you're going to transfer that skill and that muscle to all the areas, opposed to just having. If you do want to go rounded back, you'll be super fast off the floor. You'll probably have giant erectors, but you'll have issues with like loading. So that final triple extension on the stones, tire flip, like you name it. But yeah, that is kind of an advanced strategy. Some strongman guys, they use the suit, they use a rounded back, but I wouldn't get into that. It's not. I wouldn't advise that at all.
I think the issue is as well, you undercook your glutes and hamstrings when you're always pulling like that because you overemphasize the back, and obviously your glutes are your more powerful muscles, and especially with the hip hinge, you're pushing with your legs, so it's important to actually use your legs. But I'll also bring the technical side over to you, Mona, regarding weightlifting, because a lot of people get confused, and they confuse the idea. It's a pet peeve of mine. People will teach the Romanian deadlift and the deadlift as regressions for teaching the various clean positions, even though they're completely different. So you want to maybe dive? Okay, let's start here. Is deadlifting something that you would prescribe to a weightlifter, or is it something that weightlifters ever do, or is everything done to the clean pull, snatch pull standard?
Well, it is something that I would recommend firstly, but I don't like calling it like deadlift or conventional deadlift. I would call it the clean deadlift or the snatch deadlift. And the reason why is because in weightlifting, you want whatever strength movements you do have to mimic what you are going to be doing in the lift. So, for example, with like say strongman or powerlifting, or even in CrossFit, where your technique is totally different, or maybe your technique is even irrelevant. It's just about how heavy you can lift. With weightlifting, it's totally different, because if you start deadlifting and lifting the weight with a round back, or maybe you sit too far back onto your heels, or you do it like a Romanian deadlift, and now you go and do a clean, you're not going to get that strength transfer. So you want to make sure that the way you do your deadlift is the exact way you would clean. Now, what I would do is, when it comes to progressions, is the clean deadlift is a really nice way of teaching the athlete how to start or how to pull from the ground to the fully extended position. But now again, when you teach them that, you want to teach them, feet placement, either hip width or just wider than hip width, exactly the same way as what you would clean. You would push with your full foot. So you don't want your weight too far forward. You don't want your weight too far in the heels. Like, you literally want to push with your full foot. You then want to stay over the bar as long as possible. Keep that back nice and straight. And then, like in weightlifting, you've got like an accelerated pull. So you'll start off a bit slower from the ground, but you'll have that tension on the barbell. And once it passes the knee, you want to aggressively pull yourself up into the fully extended position. But what I do like to teach athletes is, when they do the clean deadlift, instead of when they get to that fully extended position, I actually want them to do a bit of a shrug, because that's exactly the way that you would clean. And it teaches the athlete to then get full extension or get tall in the movement. Instead of, for example, in CrossFit or maybe even powerlifting, where they have to get that full extension to get that full lift, the athletes will get that full extension and they'll end up relaxing their lower backs. And in weightlifting, that's where you lose a lot of tension. So you are going to lose a lot of strength at the end of the day, and it's not going to mimic that movement, because in weightlifting, again, when you do a clean pull or when you do a clean or a snatch, whatever, the movement before you pull yourself under the barbell is you extend fully onto the balls of your feet. So you have triple extension, ankles, knees, hips, and then you'll pull yourself under the bar. So it's just important to make sure that you do those movements correctly in order then to make sure that it's going to transfer properly to your Olympic lift. So on technical side, that's how you would do it. Again, I would always emphasize, get tall, don't relax the lower back, don't overextend, because that's not how you're going to be doing an Olympic lift. In CrossFit as well, people come in and, they've got a CrossFit background and they do either snatch deadlifts or clean deadlifts, and they get that super hyper extension on top. And that's mostly how athletes also end up, like, especially ones that come into weightlifting, how they end up hurting their lower backs and stuff like that. So you want to make sure just your movements, Colm laughing at Mia. Yeah, you just want to make sure that your movements correlate and have that goal in mind to improve weightlifting and not get a bigger deadlift.
Yeah, my headphones just died, but I'm listening to you from the other room. I'm going to come get my speaker now. But to see the next chat, obviously you talked about having the weight in the middle of your foot. Obviously, the positions are different, where in the weightlifting, you're going to be over the bar, as Cole mentioned. With deadlifting, the most way you're almost behind the bar, using the bar as a counterbalance. Cole, where are you having the pressure in your feet when you're deadlifting? Are you trying to maintain most of the weight in your heels when you're pushing from the floor?
I personally still like that cue of pushing towards the heels a bit more. In recent years, I've seen it kind of go away a little bit, even in the powerlifting world. People, saying technically the pressure is always going to be going through the midfoot and this sort of thing. But I find that cue, obviously, like if you're coaching someone, you can immediately see if they're over cueing and starting to lift those toes or something like that. But I like it as a general starting point, with the idea of kind of leaning back that little bit. Like you were saying, how it's the opposite. Well, it's not the opposite, but it's different to weightlifting where you're staying over the bar a little bit more. But I think, cueing the weight a little bit more to the heels just kind of helps push people in that direction. But yeah, when it can be taken, like obviously, like I said, if you're coaching and you see someone actually starting to fall back and lifting their toes up, that's not what we're talking about. Just emphasizing a little bit more pressure towards the heel.
Yeah. And then obviously there's big differences once you pass the knee when we talk about deadlifting versus some of the Olympic variations. But obviously with the deadlift, as soon as you get into the knees, you're trying to thrust your hips forward as quick as possible. But when you're weightlifting, you're trying to maintain that back angle and be over the bar as long as possible, so you can maintain essentially a vertical pull with the barbell versus a deadlift when you're trying to bring the hips forward there. But I think those are pretty much the main technical points of the deadlift. A lot of it is that setup, getting that right, and everything else seems to fall into place. I guess one of the other big mistakes that beginners or novice lifters typically make is at the top of the deadlift during the lockout, they might roll their shoulders. Have you seen people do that recently, Colm, at all? I don't know if people still do that, but used to see people at the top of the movement like roll their shoulders back or do something weird.
Not so much recently, but I did used to see that a lot years ago.
Yeah.
But I think it's kind of fallen off.
Was there like was there like some like bodybuilder or really good powerlifter that maybe did it and then everyone just like copied that person? Because sometimes those trends starts with like someone doing it and then everyone is like, this is gospel. This is how you should do it.
I don't know who it was, but someone definitely used to do that. Someone definitely started that trend.
I'm not sure why people do that, but if you're doing that, don't do that. Your shoulders should just stay in place. And then obviously squeezing your butt forward as you lock out the deadlift as well. Do you want to maybe dive into actually hitching versus not hitching, Colm? Kind of what it is, and I guess when you can do it and can't.
So in strongman competition, they allow hitching, and hitching is normally where you, let's say the bar's at a certain point on your thigh. Instead of lifting the bar, you kind of manipulate yourself around the bar. So Derek Poundstone is a perfect example of someone who did this like a really exaggerated hitch. It can also be like ramping is pretty much the same thing, but where you're kind of pushing the bar forward to get rid of the friction, and you're kind of bumping the bar up as you're coming. So you're getting it away from the body just a tiny bit, but to get rid of that friction so you can get it up. This is all illegal in powerlifting, so definitely don't do it. In strongman, it is legal. I still advise most of my athletes to not hitch for the vast majority of training because, just like you mentioned earlier, if you always hitch, it's going to, similar to rounding the back, you're just going to be undercooking the glutes. And we want to take advantage of training the glutes. And yeah, hitching essentially is you're manipulating yourself around the bar opposed to using the muscles to lock it out. In a strongman, let's say you've got a strongman competition in say 12 weeks or whatever, I do allow athletes to do their final heavy session with a hitch, perhaps their final 2 heavy sessions with a hitch if they are planning to do it. I don't think I have also seen an argument, which honestly I think is mainly revolved around ego, but sometimes I've seen the argument that you need to practice the hitch, therefore you need to do it weekly because it is a skill. Personally, I think it's a very low skill thing. It's not hard to do. You can pick it up, and honestly, like it's just bad technique. You can pick up doing it in one session easy enough, and if you've got 2 sessions to practice it, easy enough. So yeah, the majority of your training should definitely be without a hitch. And remember, even though deadlift can be a single event in strongman competition, a lot of the time we're deadlifting because we want it to carry over to other lifts. So for it to carry over to other lifts, we want to be doing a nice solid lockout to involve those glutes and hip extensors. And if we're doing a hitch all the time, that's not going to be the case, and it's not going to carry over to other events like stones and whatnot. So yeah, very similar arguments as with the rounding of the back excessively.
Yeah. And when we talk about lockout, I got that explained to me best when I first started lifting, and we called it the jail squeeze. And it's to squeeze your butt so hard, like you're in jail, like you're in the jail showers, so nothing can go in there, basically. So that's how you're going to lock out the deadlift at the top. This is the jail squeeze. I'm sure anyone listening will remember that next time they go do deadlifts. But let's also bring this back outside of the strength sport athlete that maybe competes in the deadlift. So, for example, obviously, powerlifters and strongmen use the deadlift within competition, so they're doing the deadlift in training to get a bigger deadlift for those. Weightlifters will use clean deadlift, snatches, etc., to improve the snatch, clean, and jerk. That's cool. But what about maybe the general strength trainee or someone who's after more physique goals? These people, they don't need to deadlift to achieve a lot of these things, but they might use it to help with these things. Now, I'll pass this one on to you again, Colin. There, do you find the deadlift to be a good option if someone is looking to gain general size? And then would it be something you would recommend for general strength as well?
So I still do use it quite a bit with general population. I tend to favor a trap bar deadlift for general population, but ultimately I do use it quite a bit for people who seem to enjoy it. And in terms of the 2 styles, right, how we were kind of mentioning before, there's the kind of almost leaning back in a way, powerlifting strongman style, or there's the more clean deadlift style where you're staying over the bar. I just go with whichever variation they personally gravitate towards. Physique-wise, I don't feel like there's going to be a huge difference between the hypertrophy effects of either one. I would rather just find the one that they most naturally feel good with, it looks safe, and then we'll just progress from there. But in a general sense, I definitely think it has a place in building up some basic like muscle thickness. I know we've spoken about that before. It can be a nice kind of compound move to get that thick look going, and it hits so many different areas. It's just a nice one to do for someone who's relatively new. Maybe an advanced bodybuilder who's very competitive might get away from the deadlift and focus on like specific exercises a little bit more, but that's because they're going to be so strong. The load's going to take too much away from the other training. But for general population, I do think it's a great exercise. Kind of like with the squats as well. I think pretty much any variation that the client can perform adequately is going to be a great variation, whether that's trap bar, more of a powerlifting style, more of a clean style. So yeah, overall, I think it's a great exercise, and definitely for strength as well. For strength, it's going to help with anything picking up something off the floor. A lot of the times in sport, you're bent over, so it's going to help in those sort of positions in a general sense. So yeah, I do think it's good. And if we're going with, a lot of the time, safety-wise, I find if we're just going to the variation that the client kind of gravitates towards, you're in good stead. It's when you start trying to make them do something that they are just, if they're new to something, they're not, they don't have a lot of experience with sport, it might take them a little bit longer to pick up. So yeah, I wouldn't be set and, don't have the idea, be married to the idea of, okay, every client must do this conventional style deadlift, pulling the tension. If they gravitate towards the other way, I would just go the other way, and it seems to be quite smooth sailing.
I have a question for you, Cole. And even for James, what are your thoughts? Because I know, as of recent, there's been a lot of controversy and kind of people bashing on the sumo deadlift. And I know, for example, with Steffi Cohen, she's broke multiple world records. I don't even know how many, but a whole bunch. But I think she's the one doing more of obviously the sumo deadlift, instead of how others do the conventional deadlift with your feet just wider than hip width or whatever, and they do it more in a sumo way or just traditional way. But yeah, what are your thoughts around people calling the sumo deadlift not a real deadlift, and then the conventional deadlift a real deadlift?
That's on you,
Who wants to go first? So personally, I would still call the sumo deadlift a deadlift. I wouldn't get bogged down, and I hate those kind of arguments, talking about names and that. There's so many different names for pretty much everything in what we do in terms of exercises. As an exercise, so in strongman, you're not actually allowed to sumo deadlift. That's most of the reason I wouldn't use it. I do have clients who are powerlifters who use the sumo deadlift in competition. I used to train someone years ago who they would regularly train both styles and just compete in whichever was feeling better leading up to the comp. And I actually think that's quite a nice idea for powerlifting if someone's got the mobility required for the sumo. Because there's only 3 lifts, it can get a bit boring if you've got a 4th variation in there that is going to strengthen the glutes. Maybe not the most effective way too, but it's still some nice variety. In terms of general population, I can't say I use the sumo a lot. I would just rather go with a different variation. That being said, I still think it's a good tool to have in the tool belt. And working around injuries, there's definitely opportunities where you might be able to get away with doing a sumo deadlift, but you perhaps couldn't with a conventional, mainly with lower back issues. I also do feel the sumo has a place in teaching people to pull out the tension of the bar for the conventional deadlifts. Because to do an effective sumo deadlift, you have to really pull the tension out in a powerlifting style. Not so much the modified version like Ed Cohen used, but sometimes you can get the people to understand the concept of pulling the tension out on a sumo, and then they can transfer it to a conventional. And yeah, I suppose.
Before getting back to the podcast, I want to let you know that down in the description is a link to the Lift Big, Eat Big Underground. And within that, you get access to all our training programs, online courses, and into our private Discord community, where all 3 of us are in there to help you with whatever it is with your training. Regarding the programs, we have Mona, who's done all of the weightlifting cycles. We have Colm, who's done the strongman off-season and strongman competition programs. Then we have all the hallmark Lift Big, Eat Big training programs, Pump Dragon, Flanks Method, and many more. And I've also added muscle building specialization programs within that, and are continuing to update and add training programs into our app. You also get access to Mona's Weightlifting Mastery online course, and you get to join these calls live in the audience where you can ask members only question and answers at the end of each episode. So if that sounds like you, go down in the description. There's a link there to the Lift Big Big Underground, and that'll give you access to everything I just mentioned.
Those are all my thoughts on sumo.
And like if a powerlifter had to come to you and like say they're not sure if they want to do sumo deadlift or the conventional deadlift, is there like a specific body type that you would always say this kind of body type? Because when you look at Steffi Cohen, for example, like she's super short, super jacked. Is that the kind of body type that you would say would do the sumo deadlift compared to like a much taller, leaner looking person?
That definitely has been the common thought for a while, is the shorter, stockier people, or maybe the people who have naturally very good squats, tend to favor sumo, maybe shorter arms. But this is kind of my own opinion, but I feel like the majority of people, if they put a lot of time into the mobility requirements and train sumo, I actually think the majority of people would be stronger sumo.
Is it because the distance is shorter to pull?
The distance is shorter. The research that we have on it, like you're doing less mechanical work. But I think a lot of people they just don't train it that way because they're not powerlifters. Like really, that's the only sport that you should like really be focusing on it that much, is if you're a powerlifter. Because strongman definitely can't do it. It's not really going to transfer to weightlifting at all. Have they ever had sumo in a CrossFit comp?
So they are no, they haven't specifically had it, but you can do it.
Yeah.
You can do it because.
So if they had a deadlift ladder at CrossFit Games, you would be allowed to sumo it.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
So they've had that in the past when I would compete, and that's why I was curious to know, because like my deadlift and my sumo deadlift was exactly the same, but I enjoy doing the sumo deadlift just because, kind of what you said earlier, it just creates a little bit of a variation because I've never done that. But I do have a strong squat as well. So I never trained for it. And the first time I did it, I also deadlifted 170. So I don't know if I had to have trained in that position and trained, to do the sumo deadlift, would I have maybe deadlifted more or not? I'm not really sure. But then when it came to the competition, I just did conventional because that's naturally where my mind went to, because obviously I'm more confident in doing that. Yeah, so they do. And I think it kind of just depends in like if you compete in a competition, and in CrossFit, they very much make the rules on the fly. It's not like super standard, like forever, this is how you would deadlift. Maybe the next CrossFit Games, they will say everyone has to sumo deadlift. Or maybe the next CrossFit Games or whatever competition, they'll say everyone has to do conventional. No one is allowed to do sumo. So they change the rules all the time. So there's no set way.
Yeah, and like in that case, if you do CrossFit, I think it's worth having a sumo in there every now and again. Because I have seen a lot of people, unfortunately, tear their adductors just because a lot of the time, it's such a mechanically strong position. You can use quite a bit of weight, and people do this their first time and basically max out, which I must admit, I've made that mistake years ago. I just tried sumo and I maxed it out. Unfortunately, I walked away fine. But yeah, I would say like CrossFit wise, I would keep it in there as a rotation every now and again. Then physique wise, I probably wouldn't do sumo.
No, I wouldn't.
I don't see, like, the range of motion's too short. You could just do RDLs or something instead. And but yeah, I'll pass it on to you, James, because that's pretty much all my thoughts on sumo. It is a good exercise.
Do sumo deadlifters, obviously, a sumo deadlift doesn't transfer well to conventional, but it does the other way. I think sumo deadlifts typically train conventional deadlift in their off season for variation to bring up the sumo. Is that how it works?
Yeah, a lot of them do. Like Dr. Deadlift, Jamal, I forget his last name, but they're two very, very strong sumo deadlifters at the moment. And I think they can both also deadlift. I could be wrong. I want to say they can both do over 900 conventional as well. And they are also, how I was saying back in the day, the majority would say if you're the shorter stockier or really strong legs, you go sumo. If you're the opposite, you go conventional. These guys are both quite lanky, and they do sumo. So yeah, I do feel like if you're a powerlifter, I think it's worth trying out sumo.
Yeah, sweet. And then the other thing is around we're going to talk programming and sets and reps and all sorts of other stuff. So we'll dive straight into the sets and reps side. But I guess a question regarding around deadlifts: would you ever prescribe or do high rep deadlifts? Because obviously there's a lot of, I mean, most lifts you can do high rep stuff. So even with the compounds, you can do high rep bench, 20 rep squats. There's a whole program based around 20 rep squats. But with deadlifts, is there a place for it, or is there just an injury risk waiting to happen essentially?
So in strongman, yes, because we have deadlift for rep events where
Yeah.
like I think I've done a competition where I hit 21 reps on it was a car deadlift, but it happens. So you have to, if you're competing on it, you have to be ready for it. Other than that, though, to be honest, I wouldn't really use high rep deadlifts at all. They come with a very high fatigue cost.
Mm.
Um, like, yeah, having done them, the rest of the training week is pretty hard to work around them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, my answer would be other than unless you're a strongman competing in it, or perhaps a CrossFit athlete competing in it, I wouldn't really do it.
I used to do them when I was running 5-3-1 because the last set is
Yep,
always
yep,
5 plus 3 plus 1 plus or whatever, and usually you, I guess the advice now is usually you cap it. So you maybe do, like, if you're doing 5s a week, you cap it at 10, 3s a week, cap it at 3, whatever, 3s a week, cap it at 6, etc. But I went for broke on this one. I did 140 kilos, I think, for 12. I
yeah.
think it was, 140 for 12. It was actually at the AUT gym. Obviously, I was a
Okay,
lot younger then, so I was all good.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I don't know if I could get away with it now. I mean, doing the real high rep stuff, and you know, but the problem is, as you mentioned, the fatigue. You do that one day, you're going to be out for a few days just because you're going to be so knackered
Yeah,
doing that. So that's just something to be wary of regarding programming. But if we're talking sets reps for deadlifts, obviously because when we're deadlifting, we're pretty well focusing on getting stronger versus adding muscle mass, even though gaining muscle mass is kind of a byproduct of doing it. So we're typically not looking at doing these high reps. We're typically, for me, even doing above 6 reps is typically overkill. So like kind of like four sets of 6 would kind of be like the max volume in terms of deadlifting, maybe at whatever it is in the cycle. And then obviously got your 5 5s, 3 5s, one set of 5, you got your 3 3s, and you got your doubles and singles, and those all tend to work quite well. Mona, I don't know if I mean, with weightlifting, you're not doing high reps anyway, but regarding
No.
like clean deadlifts and things like that, are you doing anything ever above 5 reps?
No, I was just going to say that. So, like in weightlifting, also percentage wise, so you will take, for example, not your deadlift percentage when you do clean deadlifts. You will work on your whatever your clean 1 rep max is, and you'll take that as your 100%. And I always recommend, if you're a beginner level athlete, you don't want to do clean deadlifts more than what you can basically clean, because at the end of the day you just want to work on the technique and learning how to move properly from the ground to the fully extended position. But if you are an intermediate or elite level athlete, you will often see athletes work between, say, 100% of their 1 rep max clean up until like maybe even 120. You will get maybe some that works a bit higher, but the rule of thumb is as soon as your form starts to go, you want to rather drop back in weight, because again, you want to make sure that it has that strength transfer to your Olympic weightlifting. Um, so you want to keep that, straight back, stay over the bar as long as possible. And rep wise, you will always work between, mostly between like 3-4 repetitions. I mean, we do have days where we will do clean pulls, and it is 5 sets of 4 or 3 sets of 5. It's a bit more volume based, but you're not going to do like an extreme weight with it. You want to do something where you will build the strength, build the conditioning part of it, but make sure that it's going to benefit your weightlifting at the end of the day, and not hinder it.
Yeah. And along with the sets and reps column, in terms of frequency of deadlifting, I think that's something, it's one of those lifts where you see a lot of different programs have a lot of different, I guess, weekly frequencies. Often you have anywhere from once every 7, once every 10, and once every 14 days, depending on the program and the athlete. Um, whereas all the other lifts, you typically see them every week, and deadlifts that one different one. Do you want to maybe dive into a little bit of that? Is there something you've played around with, going once every 14 days or 10 days regarding deadlifting?
Yeah, so like in general, I think if you're relatively new to it, you can definitely get away with deadlifting every 7 days or heavy every 7 days. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to deadlift twice a week, but you just need to make sure one of them's on the lighter side. Definitely do not try to deadlift heavy twice a week. Um, might sound hypocritical as someone who has run Smolov Jr. for deadlifts before, but trust me, I crashed and burned so bad on that. That is a 4 day a week program, which was not designed for deadlifts, and I did it. And I ended up actually getting really sick after running that.
So did you swap the
Not
squats for
surprised.
deadlift?
Yeah. So I took the same percentages and just straight up ran it for deadlifts. This is back at AUT gym as well.
Yeah. We
And
did
I
crazy
got
shit
so
there, right?
run down. Yeah, that's where we did all the crazy stuff. I got so run down because there's a huge amount of central fatigue with deadlifts. But yeah, you can have a frequency of 2 times a week. A lot of top powerlifters do 2 times a week, but it's not both heavy. So when I say every 7 days, you could have one heavy session every 7 days. As you get stronger, you definitely need more. So actually, the first time I ever deadlifted 400, so I was stuck at 390 for like, might have been 2 or 3 years.
We're talking
And
kilos, right? Kgs.
Yep.
Yeah.
So 390 kgs. It was either 2 or 3 years, but what got me to that next step was having a heavy deadlift day, 7 days later, a light deadlift day, and then another heavy one. So
Mm.
I was going heavy every 14 days, but a beginner doesn't need to do that. The loads that I was using are so fatiguing that you need more rest. So um, if you're a beginner to intermediate, once every 7 days is fine. Step up from that. So is actually that conjugate plan that I designed. It's up on the Lift Big Eat Big Underground. You'd end up deadlifting heavy every 9 days. So it's a rotation. But 9 days seems to be quite a nice one. I've got a lot of people running that, or a variation of that at the moment. But yeah, it's kind of a spectrum. Basically, the stronger you get, the longer you're going to need. And you'll see, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think Eddie Hall's last heavy deadlift session before his 500, it might have been even a month, like it was maybe 3 weeks to a month. So he still deadlifted before that, but it was a heavy deadlift. And then it's basically a month or 3 weeks to deload and recover from that central fatigue before peaking. Thor, I want to say, was maybe 14 days. Thor's a little bit different though. He does tend to go quite heavy close. It might have even been 10 days. Maybe he did like that maybe 470 quite easily 10 days out. But still, that's, more than the 7. But there's a big difference in fatigue between deadlifting 470 and deadlifting, depending on your body weight, but yeah, deadlifting like 315 pounds or whatever.
How would someone know when to potentially start to increase the rest between deadlift days?
Unfortunately, I think it's ultimately trial and error. So I haven't been able to have like every time I've kind of been like, I think it's around the 600-pound mark. I used to go off of like the 600-pound mark or the 300-kilo mark, but then I would have a client where it just didn't work. So it's really, personally, I think it's trial and error and the person in front of you. And remembering as well, every person in front of you has different lifestyle circumstances that are going to affect that. So, like Thor being a professional athlete, his whole life revolves around his training. And that 10 days was still probably like, the limit. So that's with his whole lifestyle revolving around recovery. He still needed 10 days. If you're working a full-time job, if you've got kids, you'll probably need a little bit longer. So you could try, go from 7 to 9 days or something like that. But yeah, there's so many different factors like that go into it. I can't just give a hard. I wish I could. Trust me, I've tried, but it just doesn't work like that, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's always individual differences. So I think that covers a lot of the programming side, sets, reps, relatively basic within there. But there's more ways to build a deadlift than just deadlifting. Obviously, we talk about if you want to get better at a certain lift, you got to do that lift. But there's also room for accessory exercise to build and develop the muscles required to lift heavy weight. So, Mona, I know you like pulling a lot from the floor and you like training a lot of the same muscles. Do you want to maybe dive into some of the exercises that you find useful for you for building a strong deadlift?
Definitely. So for weightlifting, things that I would recommend, like accessory exercises, and I'm assuming that you're talking like strength exercises, like deficit
It can be anything.
work.
Whatever exercises you find that transfer well to building the
Okay.
deadlift.
Yeah. So I am a big believer in, in weightlifting. If an athlete isn't really good at completing their pull, or they need to increase, their pulling strength, doing deficit pulls is a go-to one that I like programming. But again, I won't recommend this for a beginner lifter. Just because I believe that you need to master the lift from the ground first before you go and add blocks and things like that and make it more complicated. But if you can do it properly, add that little deficit, and it doesn't have to be big. I always say, you can just put like 2 10 kg plates and stand on that. Or if you have a little wooden platform, stand on a wooden platform. If you can add a little bit more height to it and you can still keep your back straight and still keep your form good, you can do that as well. You can do variations where you add pauses into the movement. So you can do, say, clean deadlifts with a pause below the knee, a pause above the knee, and then get that full extension. You can do it with tempos. So you can take, say 3 seconds up, or you can, have it do a normal deadlift up and then say a 3 seconds or 5 seconds down. Again, it's very much like Colm was saying now, like there's no cookie cutter way of doing it. So like, you can run someone through like that kind of strength cycle, but often you would individualize it to the athlete and you would make sure that, it's something that athlete needs. It's not a whole, this will improve everyone's clean deadlift or everyone's clean. And then, if you battle with, the partial movement and you find that athletes maybe has a really strong pull from the ground up into the knee and from the knee up, that's when athletes normally, start rounding the back or they show weakness. Then that's where I would start to actually even do things like, clean deadlifts from blocks. So where it's different from the deficit, now you will actually have the blocks next to your side. So you'll have a shorter distance to pull. But again, making sure that you do it the same way as what you would do your weightlifting movements. Keep that tension on the bar, push with your whole foot, stay over the bar as long as possible, keep that back straight. And just making sure that when you do the deadlifts, you don't overextend. Then again, if you do other accessory movements around that, you can do single leg work. You can do things like your Romanian deadlifts. You can do, single leg Romanian deadlifts or single leg deadlifts. Things like even Bulgarian squats, all those kind of things. So there's a lot of smaller movements or single leg movements that you can also do then in order to improve your clean deadlift for weightlifting.
Yeah, I think we'll probably have a lot of crossover with these as well. But for getting the push off the floor, obviously the squat, improving your squat typically improves your deadlift, especially off the floor. There, you need that raw leg power to push. I really like floating deadlifts and floating pulls for transferring to deadlift, just because you now have to hold that tension and load for the entire set instead of resetting each time. So that's one way to kind of turn the deadlift from just a pure raw strength test and builder to something that's more geared towards building muscle. Obviously, the Romanian deadlift, we all love that one. Romanian deadlift to smash the glutes, hammies, and lower back. That's a go-to. Outside of that, you got your back training. So your pull-ups, your rows. Obviously, the croc row is touted as one of the best row variations for the deadlift. And if you're not familiar with the croc row, it's essentially a high rep dumbbell row. And typically you'll use a load so heavy that for the last 5-10 reps, you have to use some kind of body English to get a little bit of momentum for going. So you absolutely smash your grip, but you also smash your back, and you're doing 20 reps, and you're doing it with loads that you could probably only do 10 to 15 with strict form. So that's one of those ones that can pack slabs of muscle on your back. Is one of my go-tos when I'm programming a lot of different strength stuff, or trying to build muscle for a lot of strength. So that's, and if you have heavier dumbbells, you can do that. If you don't, it's a little more difficult. Then obviously you have your barbell rows on top of that. So any of those rowing variations are going to develop the back muscles for the deadlift, and obviously you have your pull-ups with that as well. Then regarding my other favorite exercise is the hyper deadlift, using the 45-degree back extension, having a loaded bar, and you're going to use a snatch grip, and then you're going to essentially do a back extension with a snatch grip with the barbell. And that absolutely lights your hamstrings, back, and glutes, just because you're fixed in place, and the only way you can move is essentially hinging the hips and shoving the hips forward like you would in a deadlift. I think I've done up to like 80 kilos doing that for reps when I was training a lot of weightlifting, and that was, that exercise, if you're going to have an accessory exercise, that's an awesome one that I recommend to do if you have a 45-degree back extension, and if you have one that is stable enough as well. But what have you got there, Coleman, and one that you like to use?
So my go-tos are RDLs and good mornings. And if they've got that equipment, I also love that 45-degree back extension. So normally I think of it, really simplifying it, I think of the actual deadlift training as you're training your like neurological system, and then I think of building the muscles for the deadlift with one of those variations, whether it's RDLs, good mornings, or the 45-degree extension, like specifically for posterior chain. But absolutely, you got to do your rows, got to do your squats as well. But those are my main go-tos. I love all those variations. And not just for strength athletes, physique-wise as well. I think they're fantastic. Yeah. General population, fantastic as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting that none of us see kettlebell swings. And I know the kettlebell swing is often given as God's answer to all things lifting because it involves a kettlebell. But yeah, I've fallen into the wagon. Kettlebell swing is a great exercise, but I don't think it's one that's going to make your deadlift explode. I think the loads are typically too light. Even if you're going heavier swings, it doesn't load the same way as pulling a heavy bar from the floor. So I don't know what your guys' opinion on that is, or if you disagree, or you like the kettlebell swing for that purpose.
Well, in weightlifting, there would be no real carryover.
No.
Like, yeah. I mean, doing a kettlebell swing, I mean, if you come from CrossFit, it would help just because, you do kettlebell swings in CrossFit, but I've never even thought of actually recommending that to a person. I don't know how the transfer would be. I don't know. Maybe Cole has a different outlook on that. But yeah,
I definitely like
I'm a fan.
kettlebell swings. But yeah, to specifically assist the deadlift, I think there's better options. But I just like kettlebell swings as a general kind of exercise. If someone has, I think the load is the big thing. Like I mentioned last time, I think that quite a few of my clients have those Denny stone handle things. So you can load plates on it and you can do a swing variation. But yeah, if you're looking just to improve your deadlift, I would go with more of a deadlift variation.
Yeah, no, for
Pretty
sure.
much any of those exercises we said, I would go over kettlebell swing. Funnily enough, though, in Andy Bolton's book, he's actually talks about the kettlebell swing as one of the moves he likes as an assistance move. So he does it in RDL kind of posture, but his deadlift is it's almost like an RDL. He's got relatively long arms, and his hips are quite high when he does it. So I could see a little bit of a carryover. And also he was talking about doing it with a 90 kg kettlebell, which I don't know where he's got that, but that's a pretty damn big kettlebell. Not everyone has access to that.
Yeah, we actually have used one at the gym, one of the gyms
like
here.
200 pounds?
Yeah,
there's one at Outright, Mona, that we actually got sent a bunch of stuff when the rugby team we must have had a kettle. I think did they sponsor us or did we buy them? I think they must have sponsored us and sent us a bunch of kettlebells. And Yeah, I think we have a massive 90-pound one there. But the only problem is it gets so big. I don't know how it would fit between your legs, and then the handle's so
Oh,
thick. You must like it must slip out of your hands when you're swinging that thing. So that's
yeah.
the only issue once they get that big.
Yeah, if the
But the
handle
yeah
increases in diameter as they get heavier, then it's not that good.
yeah that becomes a little more difficult. But other one we didn't mention as well is the stiff leg deadlift. And a lot of people get mixed up with Romanian deadlift, stiff leg deadlift, and they often think it's the same thing. But Romanian deadlift is top down, so you're always starting from the top, um, bringing the bar down and coming back up. Where the stiff leg deadlift always starts from the bottom, and you're starting from the same dead stop like a deadlift. But you're essentially uh, you got straighter legs, and you're essentially just hinging it with your hips. You're not pushing with your legs like you would in a deadlift with a stiff leg. I don't know if you use the stiff leg often, Comma. I was using it for a while. I loved it. It felt so good. Um, just loading the hamstrings and just like hinging the weight to lock out. But I don't know if that's something you use to improve the deadlift at all.
Yep, definitely with the goal of strength. So I've done a ton of those myself. I think in the prep for one of my last powerlifting comps, we had like a couple blocks of that in there. One was well where I started on a small block and then did that stiff leg pull. I
Okay.
do think they're a great exercise to help specifically like deadlift strength. Um, in general, so I do, yeah, I think they're a great option. As well, I think they're a good option in the off season. In general, though, I tend to go with. I feel like it's kind of cheating using two exercises to compare to one, but I feel like with some kind of conventional deadlift in there and then the RDLs, I feel like both things are covered. And I feel like having that conventional deadlift in there, they can practice pulling out the tension like they need to. But maybe say myself, like a little bit more advanced, who had already had it down pretty well pulling the tension out. I was able to get away from the conventional deadlift that also comes with quite heavy loads and is quite fatiguing, and just do that stiff-legged deadlift as my main work when I was a little bit further away from the competition. Um, and yeah, that
Yeah.
seemed to work pretty well. I also think they can be done wrong relatively easily though, so you have
Oh
to
yeah.
make sure you're doing those ones correctly for sure.
No, definitely. And I think a good way to finish this the is squatting and deadlifting the same day. So I think back in the day there were a lot of programs that had squats and deadlifts the same day. I don't know if many people program like that now. I don't think there's anything wrong with it when you can do it right. I used to squat and deadlift the same day every week. Back at the AUT gym when we used to
Yeah,
do crazy stuff. I would max out squat and then go max out deadlift. That's the
yeah,
ultimate program right there. I got
for
to,
sure.
I think I got to 141 kilo back squat in bare feet, and then I got to a 180 kg deadlift, and that was just same day, one after another, and a
Yeah.
74 kilo body weight. That's not too
It's not
bad,
bad.
eh?
Yeah,
Squat and
it's
deadlift
pretty
same
good.
day, so there's an
Yeah,
anecdote for that. For that, but I found if you are going to squat and deadlift same day, squat first.
yeah,
Just feel so much better doing that. If you deadlift first, like your squat, like you've just too taxed to stabilize that bar and stuff like that. So, you got any top tips there, Colin, for anyone who may look to squat deadlift same day just for time reasons or just because of their schedule?
yeah. I think it's a great option. Um, I do tend to use that setup quite a lot with strongmen as well because we have to get in all the events training on a different day. So you don't always
Mm,
have the luxury of two lower body compound days like that. But a go-to of mine would be a front squat first and then a deadlift. Warms you up
mm,
nicely for the deadlift. And this is more for strongman, but front squat carries over nicely. But you can also do the same thing if you're a powerlifter, and maybe one week you do like a low bar squat followed up by an RDL, and then the following week front squat followed by a deadlift. Otherwise, I think you just have to, if you're going to do your competition variation on both, you just have to be sensible about it. So although we kind of, I know you just admitted it, and I've done that before as well, maxing both of them out. It's not the smart way to do it. Just be sensible about it, and start with a load. Like think of your deadlift. So there's your competition deadlift over here, and then here's your training deadlift done after squats. It's going to be a lower max. Go off that. Don't use a percentage based program and type in, your competition max. that you hit, or your fresh deadlift max. It's not exactly
Yeah.
the same lift. So just be sensible about it. But it can
Actually,
be
I think
done.
when I pulled that 215, it was at HPC. I think you were there. It was our Christmas max out. And I think I squatted. I think you must have been spotting me when I squatted 180 kilos before that. So I squatted 180 and then pulled
Yeah.
215. Almost like a powerlifting meet. And then I think we walked the yoke and did all sorts of crazy shit. But yeah,
Yeah. Everything that we shouldn't do.
that was the Christmas max out. That was
Yeah,
was
I
the thing to
suppose.
look forward to every year.
Yeah, at the same time, that in a way is kind of a comp. Like, it's not like,
Yeah,
well, we
that's not
probably
all
did
the
do
time.
that every week, but it's okay to do that if you're, leading up to it, and then you're going to recover afterwards. See, the thing is, like, what did you do that and then go to R&B afterwards or something?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't remember.
Ruin the immune system recovery.
Yeah, back in those days, it was just didn't matter what you did. You just
Yeah,
so you're young, you just recover. You max out all the time in the gym at uni, and then go out on the weekend, and you can just continue maxing out.
yeah, crazy.
Typical. It's like how Mona did it, eh?
I won't answer. I'll just be like, okay.
No, Mona was a
No.
dedicated professional athlete through her time.
And
So
I feel like now even more so. I feel like my professional athlete life has come out with being a mom, because we can't even go out for like past 9 p.m. and then we're dead. And then we need a week to recover from going
that
out
is true.
until 9 p.m.
That is true. No, I think we covered everything on this podcast. Remember, down in the description or even on the website, liftbiggebig.com, there's the Lift Biggie Big Underground. We have all the training programs in there. We've actually got some new weightlifting cycles going up soon. Mona's putting up some 5-day-a-week weightlifting cycles. Colm's still got his strongman cycles on there too, because conjugate, one that you can just keep running forever. Farmers handle specialization ones, off-season programs, deadlift specialization, more deadlift specializations coming soon. So if you're interested in deadlifting, that'll be there for you as well. But please like, subscribe, give us a rating on Spotify as well. Comments, all of that helps with this podcast. And I know Mia looks very excited there with the podcast. But we will see you next week.
If they want to continue seeing Mia, they need to support our podcast.
You better like this if you want to see more of Mia. And next week we're gonna talk squats, and we're gonna cover everything to do with squatting like we just did with deadlifting. So stay tuned for next week.